So we have Bobby Fischer versus Dr. Anthony Saidy, although he wasn't a doctor yet. I think Saidy's still alive too, isn't he? Born May 16th, 1937. He became an international master in 1969. He won Amir Ali. He won the Canadian Open in 1960. He did get his MD and served as a doctor with the U.S. Peace Corps in Jamaica from 1963 to 65. He was a county doctor in Los Angeles, specializing in tuberculosis. He retired from the practice in 2000. Well, not only did he win the 1960 Canadian Open, he won the American Open in 1967 and repeated that 25 years later in 1992. We have E4 here and C5, the Sicilian defense. Knight F3, Knight C6, the old Sicilian. And with pawn D4 and pawn takes pawn, we have an open Sicilian. Knight takes the pawn here. Paul Kedis' variation. Now knight F6, knight C3, pawn D6. Now bishop C4. Sozin's attack. Nowadays often called the Fischer-Sozin attack. Bishop D7, bishop B3. And now E6 is not the usual move. Usually we get G6 here, followed by F3, knight takes knight, queen takes knight, bishop G7. In the most common continuation is bishop E3 and castles. In this game, E6 was played by Saidy. Bobby castles here, which is also out of the ordinary, bishop E3 being the most common move. Let me show you that. Bishop E3, bishop E7, queen E2, rook C8, queenside castles here. That is the most common line. Bobby with kingside castles. Now bishop E7, bishop E3, and when we castle, we transpose to the main line of the Leonhardt variation. That brings another name that you may or may not be familiar with to our attention. Paul Leonhardt, who lived from 13 November 1877 to 14 December 1934. He was a German chess master, died of a heart attack in Königsberg while playing chess. Fairly low-profile player with not many tournament wins, and has largely been forgotten. Well, even history lovers like myself, many of them don't know Paul Leonhardt. But at his best, he was able to defeat the most elite players, including Tarrasch, Tartakover, Morozzi, Nimzovich, Reti. All of these succumbed to his fierce attacking style between 1903 and 1920, and he won several brilliancy prizes. Leonhardt's variation, and this is the main line, which continues with F4, knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, bishop C6. Now Bobby with queen E2, pawn B5, knight takes B5, and the most frequent is bishop takes the knight here. Saidy with bishop takes the pawn, gets a question mark. Usually, you trade the bishop for the knight and then take the pawn with your knight. Instead, Saidy goes with bishop takes the E-man. Well, that allows knight takes the A-man, defended by the bishop. Do not play bishop takes the knight, which will be answered by bishop takes bishop. The idea of bishop takes the knight is to remove the defender and get this here. But after queen b6 check, king has to move, and then queen can take the knight. Let's go back. So knight takes the A-man. Pawn e5, pawn takes the pawn. Pawn takes the pawn, now bishop to e3. You can see the eval bar puts white a smidge better. Queen b8, super attacking the knight, which retreats to b5. Bishop c6, super attacking the knight again, which retreats to c3. Queen b4, Queen's rook to d1, taking up residence on the open file. Rook to a5. Rook d2 and queen h4. The bot calling for queen b8. I was wondering if pawn to e4 would have been in order to facilitate a rook slide. I do get a check mark. It just gives the rook some mobility across the board. But queen h4 was played. Bishop to b6 hits the rook. And now he would like to play rook takes the knight, I think. Well, rook to c5 is quite an interesting move. Trying to get us to capture the rook, which is not the best choice. And the reason it's not the best choice, let me go ahead and show. First of all, let me show what Bobby played. He played rook d3, queen e1 being called for. But the reason you do not want to play bishop takes the rook is because it allows bishop takes the bishop. And look at that eval bar. And that gives check, forcing the king to h1, and now knight g4 comes in, super attacking the h-man, threatening checkmate. And there's no way to avoid the checkmate except to capture the knight with your queen, which is obviously losing. So don't grab that rook. Rook d3 is what Bobby played. And rook b8. e4 still the best choice here. Hit this rook, open up for this rook. We'd have to play rook h3 to put a stop to this attack, but I would imagine queen g5 here. Now you can play bishop takes the rook safely, I think. And after bishop takes bishop check, king h1. And perhaps you can push this pawn. That gets a question mark. Now, do not go for the knight g4 move here, because now rook h3 packs a bigger punch. And I think I can just get right in line with the queen and the king here. Nope, that also gets... Oh, it changed its mind. Check mark. You don't want to play queen d3 here, I don't think. Hoping for a cheap checkmate. It gets a question mark. Well, rook b8 is what was played. Bishop takes the rook here. Bishop takes the bishop check. And by the way, if you play knight g4 here, that opens this line. Bishop takes the pawn with check, and then you can h3. Well, bishop takes bishop was played with check, king h1, pawn h5. Knight g4 now could finally be played, I think. It's been begging to be played. I think we could still play the bishop takes pawn. You don't need to play h3 here. First of all, it's going to allow the fork. And then one of these two guys can grab the rook. But you can play the bishop takes the pawn here. Let's go back here. All right, well, h5 was played. Queen takes the e-man, bishop to a7, and queen g3. Black resigned here. If you play queen takes queen, I'll play rook takes queen, lining up with your king, which if you play to h7, I will give myself some breathing room. If you hit my rook, I'll move it to d3. And if you try to worm your way in here, I will take this rook and capture your pawn. So your check will be fairly empty, and I can tuck away on the square that I made for myself when I played h3. If you play rook b7, I think I'd play rook f4 here. That would force the pawn to g5, and etc. You couldn't play rook b8 here because then you're forked.